The title of today's presentation is Lice, Fleas, and Mosquitoes, Insects That Changed History. So it's been kind of traditional for historians when they talk about historical events, they'll talk about decisions that people have made. And very frequently, this is done at the expense of environmental or ecological factors that while they don't negate the decisions of people, it can limit their options or it can affect the outcomes. So things like epidemic diseases, as they've affected situations I'm going to talk about today, often they'll end up as kind of just like a footnote instead of an actual more critical part of the story. So let me get on to it right now. First, I'm going to talk about this gentleman right here. The title of this first section is Napoleon's Lice, as you can see. So this is Napoleon Bonaparte. No doubt you all know who this is. Now in 1810, 1811, Napoleon is really riding high. He is basically running things in Europe. Everything that you see on the map there in blue, Napoleon either rules it directly or he has control of it in some way. But he really wants to get control over Great Britain. Well, he knows he can't defeat the Royal Navy, so militarily it's going to be a problem. So what he decides he's going to do is try to put a stranglehold on their trade and hit them in the wallet, maybe weaken them that way. But he's got a problem. The problem is that the Tsar of Russia, Alexander the First, has continued to trade with the British, so he's continuing to provide the British with money. So Napoleon really wants to put a stop to this and teach Alexander the First a lesson. So what Napoleon does is he gets together the largest army in history up to that point, as far as we know, about 650,000 soldiers, 200,000 horses, and he decides he's going to ride them into Russia on the pretext of protecting the Poles from a Russian invasion. That's the cover story. He really doesn't care about protecting the Poles from the Russians. He just wants to teach Alexander the First a lesson. So he crosses into Poland and heads to Russia in June of 1812. And very shortly thereafter, he starts to have problems with his soldiers falling sick. They're experiencing blinding headaches, sensitivity to light. They're spiking very high fevers over 105 degrees. And they're just basically falling out of the march and falling alongside of the road. So he's losing soldiers every day like this in increasing numbers. And what also starts to happen is they start to get these dark spots all over their bodies, in addition to the other symptoms, the headaches, the fever. So what's happening is these men are all infested with a body louse. And this is your standard issue 6-legged body louse. It would have been very common for people in ancient times and throughout history, really, and even some places in the world now to be infected with these. But the real problem comes in when they carry this little bugger right here. This is actually typhus. So what typhus does is it lives inside the digestive system of the louse, and then when it bites someone, when that person swats the louse, it squashes them and gets those innards into the wound. It can get into the body that way, or through the feces of the louse. When someone scratches, they can actually rub it into the wound. Then what happens is the typhus will get inside basically the walls of your blood vessels, and as they multiply, it will start to cause leakage, and your circulatory system basically starts to leak into your body. So you'll get fluid on your brain, which gives you those incredibly bad headaches and photosensitivity. It can cause delirium. Some of Napoleon's men would just rant and rave. They'd sing songs out loud while they were laying in the hospital. It can go into a coma, and eventually it can cause death, as it does in a large number of cases. So as Napoleon's moving on his march, he's losing more and more men. And part of the problem is, in addition to the very poor hygiene that will be present on the march, is the men tend to congregate together in large groups, especially when it starts to get cold. And that makes it very easy for the louse to leap from one person to another. They basically crawl from one person to the next. So especially in hospitals, this becomes a problem. When you've got a hospital full of wounded, and there's also typhus cases in there, it's very easy for typhus to pass from patient to patient. It's sometimes called hospital fever for that very reason. So as Napoleon continues on his march, he continues to lose more and more men. So by the end of June, it's estimated he's lost as many as 30,000 troops. So by the time he reaches Vilnius, which is about a week in, he hasn't even met the enemy yet, and he's down 30,000 soldiers. So one historian has estimated that over the course of his campaign, over the course of 10 weeks, Napoleon lost between 4,000 and 6,000 soldiers per day. So the extent of it really becomes clear when he reaches finally a decisive battle with the Russians. For weeks, the Russians have been just basically retreating, pulling Napoleon deeper and deeper into Russia. And as they're going, they're basically depriving Napoleon's army of supplies, anything that they can take. They're basically doing scorched earth warfare. So Napoleon's able to really get very little in the way of supplies, and he's really antagonizing the Russian peasants on the way, to the point that when his soldiers do fall out of the march and fall ill, frequently they will commit suicide rather than risk being found by the Russian peasants. They feared being found by the Russian peasants and the Cossacks probably far more than they feared being found by the Russian army. So finally, Napoleon reaches a place called Borodino on September the 7th. Now, by this time, Napoleon's down to less than a third of his force. He's got about 130,000 soldiers left out of the original 650,000 that are able to fight. So this really limits Napoleon's options. Napoleon liked to do maneuver warfare. He liked to strike from unexpected angles. He liked to basically outmaneuver his opponents. He didn't like to do big frontal assaults. But by this point, Napoleon's got few soldiers. He feels like he's got limited options. So what he does is he basically assaults this Russian defensive position along this 3-mile front. There's over 260,000 soldiers and 1,000 cannons in this little tiny front. And it's just a horrible battle. 72,000 soldiers on both sides are killed. The French do win. They drive the Russians from the field. And Napoleon's generals are begging him to commit his reserves, chase the Russians down, finish it off so they can end the war. Napoleon at this point feels like he can't risk doing that because all he's got left is 25,000 soldiers in reserve, and he's afraid that if he has to fight another battle to take Moscow, he's just not going to have the soldiers left to do it with because he's lost so many from disease. So the Russian army escapes. Napoleon continues marching on to Moscow. September 14th, he arrives in Moscow, and again, as he's going, more and more soldiers are getting sick. He's probably down to maybe 100,000 soldiers or less left by the time he reaches Moscow. But what the Russians have done is they've abandoned the city, and very shortly after they abandon it, they basically torch it. So they're trying to burn the city down and deprive the French of shelter. So Napoleon hangs out in Moscow. His thought process is, I've occupied Alexander's capital. Now he's going to have no choice but to negotiate a settlement. And so here he is in Moscow. So Alexander the First does not come to negotiate a settlement, and Napoleon sits there until the middle of October when it starts snowing. So now Napoleon's in a very bad situation. He has no choice but to start heading back across the Russian border. Now, he doesn't want to go back the way he came because he knows that there's been no supplies left. He knows that the troops have completely stripped it bare. Whatever they've not gotten, the Russians have gotten. So he does not want to go back the way he came. But he doesn't have enough men left to be able to fight through when the Russians block him. So the Russians keep him on the original road that he came in. He can't take any kind of a lateral. The Russians keep stopping him, and he's not strong enough to fight his way through that. So the retreat gets worse and worse, and he's more and more men as it goes on. So by late October, he's come to a city called Smolensk, and he is down to now about 40,000 soldiers. there's no supply. He goes now to the last city before he leaves to cross into Poland, called Vilnius. And at this point now, they figure about 20 men march into Vilnius. The Vilnius time is taken in the early 2000 project filled with victims. Soviets found was these were actually Napoleon's men. Now what you see here is this is a skull, and that skull is what was called a shako. And the shako is basically a distinctive headgear that was worn by some of the French infantry. So they're finding that kind of thing. They're finding coins and bits of insignia.
We're having some technical
all of
difficulties.
those.
You're frozen.
I'm frozen?
Yeah.
Okay. What do I do?
Hi guys, we're double checking. I know he was frozen, so we're gonna just double check. See if we can make sure that's all good. I hear a couple hooray, he's back. So
Am I back?
thank you for bearing with us. All right. Unfrozen now. Got some great messages.
Okay, perfect. I'm back. Okay, so I don't know how long I was frozen for, but by the time Napoleon reaches Vilnius, he's got about 20,000 men with him. Vilnius is already full of his sick and wounded from when he went in. So about 10,000 troops maybe leave Vilnius, about 10,000 or more stay behind. And they're eventually taken by the Russians. Many of them are dead by the time the Russians get there. And what the Russians end up doing is they basically use the trenches that the French had dug as defenses, and they use those as mass graves for all the victims that were in the hospitals. The Russians wanted to get them buried as quickly as possible because it was believed that it was bad air, it was bad smells that caused the disease. Of course, they were not aware of germs at the time. Germ theory was not really a thing yet, so it was assumed that it was just bad smells and miasma that was the primary cause of disease. They wanted to get rid of those bodies as quickly as possible. So there's about a little over 3,000 bodies in this particular trench right here. And when they extracted teeth and extracted the pulp from those teeth for DNA evidence, in more than 25% of the cases, they did find evidence they were infected with typhus. So I don't want to minimize other causes. On the march back from Moscow, food and water were seriously limited. There are always other diseases that would accompany armies in historic times, but typhus was definitely the most virulent of those. And having so many soldiers fall ill definitely limited Napoleon's options. It definitely caused many more of his troops to desert. A lot of the members of his army were raw recruits. And they had never experienced anything like this before. And watching a typhus epidemic unfold basically right in front of their eyes certainly induced many of them to just decide it wasn't worth it. So after that, things do not go so well for Napoleon. Now I wanted to bring this up real quick. This is a infographic, and this is from 1869. This is made by a man who was a pioneer of making infographics named Charles Menard. So if you look on the left, that top line there, the big tan line, that shows the men going into Russia. And then you look at the far right, that's Moscow. So basically each millimeter width of that bar is 1,000 men. So you can see right off the size of Napoleon's force starts dropping dramatically. Now, a lot of people blame the Russian winter for the severe loss of life, and it was certainly a major contributing factor. Temperatures got down to minus 30 degrees, so definitely a major factor, no question about it. But if you look at how thin that line got before Napoleon ever got to Moscow in the first place, it seems to me pretty clear that the disaster was already underway before Napoleon even met the enemy at Borodino. And so, as I mentioned, after that, things do not go so well for Napoleon. Before his Russian campaign, he was kind of thought as, he was pretty much invincible. He was like a wonderkind. People were afraid to face him on the battlefield. After this, obviously that reputation is severely diminished. This was a major disaster. And actually, by March of 1814, Napoleon is defeated and exiled for the first time. He would make one more comeback. So now I want to go back to ancient times, back to basically the end of the Roman Empire. And I'm going to talk about this gentleman here, Justinian the First. Now, Justinian the First has been called the last Roman. He was certainly most likely the last Roman emperor whose first language was Latin. After this, Roman emperors would be speaking Greek. So Justinian the First came to power in 527. So in the beginning of the 6th century, the Roman Empire was coming off of several centuries of bad luck. Things really went downhill in the 3rd century. 4th and 5th centuries were not great. So by the 6th century, Justinian is ready to help the Roman Empire make a comeback. So he's immensely ambitious, incredibly intelligent, and he's got big plans. And he also has a few things at his disposal. And one of those is he's got an empress who's a truly formidable woman named Theodora. She was also fiercely intelligent, very loyal to Justinian, and she was there for him to provide a positive influence at times when he really needed it. She may have also provided some negative influences, but I think that a lot of what has been written about her in ancient times was probably a hatchet job. One of the writers named Procopius didn't particularly care for her and wrote some pretty unkind things about her. But she was definitely a formidable woman, and she was there at some critical points during Justinian's reign. Now, Justinian, you can't be a Roman emperor without having a massive building plan. And Justinian actually built Hagia Sophia, which is this iconic church in what is now Istanbul. But besides just a building plan and the Justinian code of law, Justinian had other even bigger plans. And for that, he was going to need this man right here, this general named Belisarius, who was an incredibly capable general, as I'm going to show you just now. So in 527, when Justinian comes to power, if you look on the right-hand side of the screen there, all that orange, that was all the territory Justinian had. That was the extent of the Roman Empire at that point. If you look on the left-hand side of the screen, at its height, almost everything that you see on the left-hand side of the screen was under the control of the Roman Empire. The Frankish kingdom, that belonged to Rome. The kingdom of the Visigoths, that also belonged to Rome. Britain, Rome was also in Britain as well as in North Africa. But by this point, all those territories have essentially been lost to the empire, and although all those barbarian kings still kind of nominally recognize the authority of the Roman emperor, they're all kind of doing their own thing. The Justinian decides that this is an unacceptable state of affairs, and he wants those territories back in imperial hands and under imperial control. So he sends Belisarius out to get the job done. And Belisarius really has a great run of success. 533, he lands in North Africa, takes all of that from the Visigoths, or the Vandals, excuse me, and then he lands in Italy in 535 and starts taking that back from the Goths. So things are looking like they're going really well, but then there's a big setback in 541. In 541, what happens is in the capital, there's an outbreak of an illness. And what that illness causes is, among other things, you can see under that man's armpit, he's got that big, dark, swollen area there. That's called a bubo. And that is symptomatic of bubonic plague. Now, there are way more gnarly pictures of buboes, but I wanted to spare you all that. This one's fairly tame by comparison, but there are some really nasty pictures of buboes out there. I didn't want to do anything too terribly gross during lunch break science today. But in addition to that, other symptoms include things like fever. It can also turn hemorrhagic if it turns into septicemic plague. Also, pneumonic plague can be spread through people coughing, but the most common form is this called bubonic plague, where you get these buboes, these swellings on the body. So very, very high fevers, and people do end up dying in a lot of cases with plague. It is really virulent and really deadly with a high mortality rate. And the way that is spread is rats will get on board ships, and those ships will go to different ports. And at the time, Constantinople was, of course, a very big trading center. It was the center of the Roman world. So all ships would basically come to Constantinople. And of course, with ships came rats, and with rats come fleas. This is the Oriental Rat Fleet. So Oriental rat fleas can become infected with Yersinia pestis, which is the bacteria that causes bubonic plague. And the way it works is, this is Yersinia pestis. And what Yersinia pestis does, Yersinia pestis gets inside the digestive tract of the flea, and you see that big dark area in the flea's abdomen. So what it does is it basically, the flea, as it feeds, it basically can't digest the blood. So it will regurgitate that blood back inside the wound, and that will carry the plague bacteria into the victim. So it eventually will kill the flea. But in the meantime, the flea just becomes desperate to feed. Normally, rat fleas only like to feed on rats. Plague makes them desperate so that they will literally bite anything just so they can feed. And that is actually how it gets transmitted to humans, from an infected rat, an infected flea, to an infected human. So this is a very virulent plague. I'm sure you've all heard of the Black Death, which started in Europe in 1348, which killed millions of people, possibly as many as like a third of the entire population of Europe. So the big question here is, how bad was this plague? Well, Procopius, who is the main source that we have, reports that there were up to 10,000 people a day dying in the capital, that there was an official appointed by Justinian to count all the bodies and see to their burial, and that the official responsible for this could not even count all the bodies. He eventually just gave up. So there have been estimates by historians that possibly as many as 25 million people died. There is, I should point out, some new scholarship on this that came out in 2019 that suggests that it was not nearly that bad. I also myself tend to think 25 million is probably a little bit high, but still, nonetheless, it could not help but have an effect. How big the effect was is really hard to say. But if it's having an effect like this in the capital, even if it's significantly disruptive as opposed to catastrophic, the capital was still where all of the equipment for Justinian's armies was made. That's where they would have recruited soldiers, administered the collection of taxes. The price of grain skyrocketed in Constantinople because farmers were not able to harvest their crops and get them to market. So with the scope of what Justinian was attempting, and also just to add on top of it, the Persian Empire also attacked the Roman Empire in 540. So Justinian's got all sorts of problems going on at the time. And just to add to already extended resources, you've got this plague on top of it. So my opinion is it would not have to be terribly disruptive in order to cause Justinian significant problems with trying to hold on to what he had gained in Italy and the rest of Europe. And actually, as it turns out, the war in Italy with the Goths gets really, really bad. The Goths apparently were not all that affected by this plague. The city of Rome changes hands between the Romans and the Goths about 6 times over the course of a few years. So it just turns into a bloody slog in Italy. It was trying to hold on to what the empire had gained back. And eventually what ends up happening is Justinian dies, and shortly after Justinian's death, by 565, Italy was basically, for the most part, back in the hands of the Goths. So all of that starts to get chipped away at. Everything the empire had gained starts to basically get pushed back. And there's a big war with the Persians in the 7th century that starts off the 7th century. And then after that, there's wars with the Muslim powers that were going to start up after that. So the empire really took a big beating after that. So pretty much the death of Justinian is essentially the end of what we would call the Roman Empire, and it's the start of what I would call the Byzantine Empire. So just to give you an idea of how widespread this would have been throughout the empire, this is actually in Germany. This was a dig in 1967, and this is a plague burial. And then there was another one that was uncovered in the early 2000s. And what they did was, as before with the typhus victims, is they took teeth, they extracted pulp from the teeth, and they found inside the teeth Yersinia pestis. So the historical sources tell us that after the initial outbreak in 541, that the plague returned every few years after that. The evidence for that, beyond just what the historical sources say, is kind of sketchy. So it's really hard to say how accurate that is. And again, I would not argue that it killed 25 million people. I would argue that it probably did have significant impact, but I would not argue it was quite as catastrophic as some writers make out, especially if you take the historical accounts at face value. Those are very, very risky numbers to go by as a matter of course. So I would say it did significantly disrupt Justinian's ability to hold on to what had been gained. It didn't help that the Persians were attacking. And certainly by the time that Justinian died, the empire's resources were really exhausted after that, and they were in no way ready for what was about to happen in the 7th century. And it would really cost them in the 7th century. All right, so now the last section here, Nelson's mosquitoes. So it's gone a little trip down to the West Indies. This is 1780. So if you look up at the top there, it says an accurate map of the West Indies. Okay, accurate for 1780, maybe. Florida's looking a little janky. I think the scale might be somewhat off. But so there we have basically the colonies, the Americas up there. You can see France is in charge of Louisiana, and all the islands down there in the Caribbean, and then that strip of Central America and the top of South America. Those are all basically divided between France, Britain, and Spain. So Britain's got Jamaica and a few other things, and then the rest is kind of split between the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch are also in the mix as well. So 1780, Britain really has its hands full. It was already before that, it was fighting the Revolutionary War in the United States, what would become the United States. But after 1778, now they're fighting the French. Shortly after that, they're fighting the Spanish. By 1780, they're fighting the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch. So right around 1779, this gentleman right here, General Clinton, who was commander of the British forces in the American colonies, decides that the key to winning the revolution is going to be taking the Carolinas. And he assumes that there will be large numbers of loyalists in the Carolinas and that he'll be able to recruit those loyalists and help him win the war. So Clinton promptly takes Savannah and Charleston, and then he has his subordinates, General Lord Cornwallis, take over the campaign, and Clinton heads back to New York. Some people argue that he didn't like being away from his girlfriend in New York for very long, and that was the reason why he went back. But also it could be that he was trying to pin Washington down in a decisive battle, which Washington very wisely declined to have happen. So Cornwallis does not really like being in the Carolinas. He agrees with the strategy, but he disagrees with Clinton on a lot of points. So Cornwallis is fully aware that the Carolinas are filled with fevers that affect Europeans disproportionately. So he is fully aware that the more time he spends down there, the more men are going to end up sick with fevers. So what ends up happening is he ends up, in 1781, he's chasing Nathaniel Greene basically all around the Carolinas, trying to pin Greene down into a decisive battle. And the longer Cornwallis stays there, the more and more of his men get sick with these fevers and chills and body aches. So what they're experiencing is called Vivax Malaria. And that is spread by this little guy right here, Anopheles mosquito. Now these Anopheles mosquitoes were native to the United States. And here's one in action right here. Now Anopheles mosquitoes, some species of them can carry malaria, not all of them do. So Plasmodium vivax is what this particular variant of malaria is called. It doesn't kill very many people. It kills about 1% of people who are infected by it. And that little dark blob right there in the middle is the Plasmodium vivax. So again, what it does is it passes into a human through an infected mosquito. And it then takes up residence in your liver and causes you all sorts of problems. And it can cause you symptoms again and again. It can go latent for a while, and then it can come back. So it can make you really miserable. Now, the good news is that with repeated infections, that eventually it becomes less severe. So you can be infected with malaria again and again. But eventually what will happen is if you get enough times, it will no longer affect you very severely. That was no advantage to Cornwallis and his soldiers, because being newly arrived from Europe, they had no sort of immunity whatsoever. So they were very badly affected by malaria. And if you've got malaria, you absolutely cannot fight. So this is the life cycle of the Plasmodium that causes malaria. As you can see, it's extremely complicated. I'm not even going to attempt to get into it, but part of the reason why malaria is so difficult to find a treatment for, a preventative measure for it, is because it's got such a complicated life cycle. So it's really kind of difficult to get your hands on. And even right now, as of 2018, it's estimated about 285 million people that are infected with malaria, and it kills about 400,000 people a year as of 2018. But most of those do not die of the Vivax. They die of another form of malaria that I'm going to talk about a little later. But in any case, it's really making Cornwallis and his men miserable. So finally, Cornwallis decides he's had enough of this, and he heads to Virginia. So he gets orders from Clinton. Clinton tells him, find some place where there's a deep water port. So go out to the Chesapeake, find some place with a deep water port, get yourself a defensible position so I can get naval support to you. Cornwallis absolutely does not want to do that, because he's fully aware that if he gets near the swamps that are out there in the Chesapeake, that his men are going to continue to get sick. He doesn't know why. He doesn't know that it's mosquitoes that are doing it. Basically what they blame is they blame the climates, or they blame the bad air around these swamps. But Cornwallis follows orders. He goes out to Yorktown, and he begins to build a defensive position out there, hoping that the Royal Navy can come in and relieve him at some point. So Washington decides that he's going to take Lafayette, and they are going to sneak down from New York. They're going to come to Yorktown, and they're going to try to basically hem up Cornwallis there in Yorktown, where he's entrenched. And he gets the aid of the French fleet to do that. And in the Battle of Chesapeake Capes in September, the French fleet actually manages to keep the Royal Navy from getting to Yorktown. So now Cornwallis is just stuck. Now, at this point, Cornwallis has about half of his force that are able to fight. The rest are sick with malaria or other diseases. So while the French and the Americans are building their siege works and they're building the trenches to move up on Cornwallis's position, Cornwallis is not in a position to do anything about it. Ordinarily, you could send people out to kind of disrupt that activity, but Cornwallis is not able to do it. So finally, Cornwallis is at the point where he's just got no choice. He realizes that Clinton cannot get the Royal Navy in to relieve him, so he goes ahead and just surrenders to Washington. Cornwallis himself does not show up to surrender. He claims that he's ill with a fever, which he quite possibly could have been. He sends his second in command to hand his sword over to Washington, and Washington has the sword handed over to his own second in command. So in this particular case, even though it didn't kill a lot of Cornwallis' soldiers, it still had a significant impact because it limited his options. Again, he's got less than half of his force available to fight. So that really limits what he's going to be able to do in terms of offensive action. So essentially, Cornwallis at this point was just stuck. He wrote at one point to Clinton, if you can't send help soon, you should prepare to hear the worst. And that's exactly what happens. So that's not completely the end of the American Revolution, but it's close enough. But at the same time, while this is going on, there are other things going on down in the West Indies that are also going to have significant impact. So you might be asking, Jim, you named this section Nelson's mosquitoes and not Cornwallis's mosquitoes. Yes, here's why. So let's go back to the West Indies. So if you look down in the lower left-hand side of the screen there, you'll see Nicaragua. So what the British really want out of the Caribbean is they want to control as much territory as possible that produces sugar. Sugar is big business. It is huge revenue. So the British want as much as possible to get a hold of as many sugar plantations as they can. Because again, it's big money. It's a much bigger source of revenue than the American colonies. And actually, earlier in the 1750s and 60s, they did fight the 7 Years' War, which we call the French and Indian War, and a lot of the action was centered down in the West Indies. The British tried to take Havana, which they pulled it off, but they lost so many men to disease, they ended up having to give it back. So in 1780, the British decide they want to send Horatio Nelson in to take this fortress at San Juan on the San Juan River in Nicaragua. Now, he was not this guy. He was not Admiral Lord Nelson in 1780. He was a dashing young Royal Navy captain. And if you look on the right in the painting there, you can see the fortress that he went in with 1,800 men to take. So Nelson takes his 1,800 men, and he moves in on the force, but he runs into a problem. And if you look at this slide right here, you'll see all those little dark patches. Again, this is malaria, but this is a different form of malaria. This is falciparum malaria, which is far more virulent and deadly than the Vivax malaria. This form of malaria will kill up to 10% of people who contract it, and this is the malaria that's responsible for most of the deaths that occur from malaria today. Now, this is also spread by an Anopheles mosquito, just like the Vivax malaria. So certainly this would have afflicted Nelson's soldiers, but he also would have had to deal with a different mosquito that was carrying something much, much worse. This is Aedes aegypti. Aedes aegypti carries a thing called yellow fever. So while Nelson is moving in to take this fort, he's dealing with these mosquitoes carrying diseases. And yellow fever, we suspect, which again was spread by Aedes aegypti, would have been one of those diseases that he had to deal with. So yellow fever, and this is the virus that causes yellow fever, what it does is it basically, it's a type of a hemorrhagic fever. So you'll get headaches, you'll get body aches, and you can basically start to hemorrhage out your nose, out of your mouth, and you'll hemorrhage into your upper digestive tract. And then you will get what's called, in a lot of cases where it becomes fatal, what will happen is you'll get what's called black vomit. So you'll vomit up what looks like coffee grounds. And those are actually, basically it's clotted blood from where you've bled into your upper digestive tract. Again, despite very, very high fevers, and the liver damage caused by the infection will make the skin, in many cases, turn yellow, hence the name yellow fever. So of the 1,800 men that Nelson went in there with, Nelson, in fact, was out of the campaign early because he came down with a fever, which was probably, I think, malaria. So they end up losing 77% of the force. Maybe 2 or 3 men die in the siege, 1 man dies of snake bite, and then what happens is the rest that they lost, almost 1,500 men, all died from what could have been malaria in combination with other diseases, but also yellow fever is suspected with the virulence that yellow fever has. Yellow fever could easily kill 60 to 70% of the force. And it would frequently happen in the West Indies that even if you were just garrisoning troops in the West Indies, it would not be uncommon to lose 25% or half of your force just from the mosquito-borne illness that was there. Sailors and soldiers from Europe and from the United States really dreaded going on duty in the West Indies. They absolutely did not want to go to the West Indies. Desertion was very common when soldiers and sailors would find out they were going to the West Indies. There's one story that 2 sailors actually took 1,000 lashes rather than go to the West Indies. So it made recruitment for the British very, very difficult. The Spanish had an entirely different strategy. The Spanish built big fortifications like the one at San Juan because they wanted to slow enemy forces down, because they knew if they could slow them down enough, that yellow fever and malaria would do a lot of the work for them. And the Spanish recruited local people as forces to man their garrisons as much as possible because those people had immunity to yellow fever. Yellow fever was endemic in the West Indies. A lot of people would get it in childhood, and if you survive it, you have lifelong immunity. So that was kind of a built-in advantage for the Spanish, is that they kind of had this built-in defense where they didn't really have to do anything other than slow the enemy down as much as possible and let disease do the rest. So that is how Nelson lost 77% of his force on his campaign in Nicaragua. Now, I want to also go back to Napoleon. Poor Napoleon. Guy was kind of a jerk, but still. So in 1802, he had a problem in Haiti with an uprising. And he sends about 50,000 or so troops to Haiti, and they just end up getting decimated by malaria and yellow fever, to the point he maybe gets 5,000, 6,000 soldiers back. And many of the rest of them died from disease. So Napoleon, at this point, he had ambitions to get more territory in the United States. They're holding all this territory in Louisiana. Napoleon was afraid that the same kind of disease would be present in Louisiana, which he wasn't wrong. There would be frequent outbreaks of yellow fever in Louisiana and other parts of the Mississippi Valley during the 17 and 1800s. So Napoleon was not wrong. But Napoleon decides at that point, having lost so many soldiers, more soldiers than he lost at the Battle of Waterloo, he lost in Haiti. Napoleon decides at that point that it's just not worth it, and he sells Louisiana to the United States for $15 million and doubled the size of the country with the stroke of a pen. All because tiny little mosquitoes. Okay, so I've got some of my references here. I do like to include some of my references at the end of my presentations. This is by no means all of them. I did consult some academic papers and that kind of thing, but I wanted to stick to stuff here that's going to be more accessible, stuff you're going to be able to just go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble and find. I can definitely recommend the Molly Caldwell Crosby book up there at top. That is all about the yellow fever outbreaks that occurred in the 1800s that everyone has now forgotten about. But there was a particularly nasty outbreak in Memphis that killed thousands of people in 1878. The William McNeill book is a classic. William Rosen, if you're interested in finding out more about the reign of Justinian and the plague, definitely check out the William Rosen book. That's a classic. And the Stephen Talty book about the illustrious dead, about Napoleon's army, is also very good. So I can recommend any of those. All right, so at this time, we got about 10 minutes left.
Jim, I've got some, I've been monitoring the comments. It's Tim Schul here.
Yes.
A couple of questions that have come up. There was some conversation going on around some of the diseases you mentioned. Why aren't there vaccines? Or what are treatments available for some of the different diseases now versus the past?
Good question. Okay, so in the past, like when we're talking about during Nelson's time or Napoleon's time, they did have a treatment for malaria, and it's from the bark of a tree called the quinchoa tree that grows in the Andes, and from that they can get a drug called quinine. Now that is a preventative for malaria. It's a treatment for malaria that helps alleviate the symptoms, but the problem that the British had in the 1780s, of course, is they're fighting the Spanish. So the availability of that is obviously going to be very, very limited. So Cornwallis's men and Nelson's men would not have had that available to them, at least not in any great quantity. The other sorts of treatments they would have used would have been things like bleeding, cupping, that sort of thing, because they still believed at that point, many doctors did, that it was the balance of the humors, the vital fluids in the body, that could cause disease. Napoleon actually thought that you would only get sick if you had a weak character, essentially. So to him, some of his soldiers getting sick was a sign of a weakened constitution. So that might account for why he was just so bullheaded in continuing on to Moscow after he had lost so many soldiers. And that really cost him when he came out of Moscow and had to raise another army. That core of veterans that had made up the army he marched into Russia with, those men were gone. And you really need those people with that institutional experience if you're going to rebuild an army. And Napoleon just didn't have it after the Russia campaign. But there are actually vaccines available now for some of these things. There is a vaccine available for yellow fever, but not many people get it in the United States. In areas where yellow fever tends to be endemic, people do get the yellow fever shot. I actually served in the United States military, and one of the shots that you got when you went to basic training was a yellow fever shot. There's also a vaccine available for the plague. So that was one of the other ones that I got, was a plague vaccine. And again, I don't think people commonly get the plague vaccine here in the US. And there are still occasionally, people will occasionally be infected by plague from like prairie dogs. There's like less than half a dozen examples a year of that in the US here in current times. And sometimes people will go to some place where yellow fever is endemic and they won't get the yellow fever shot, and then they will themselves get yellow fever and then come back to the United States. But there's no way that yellow fever can spread from person to person. It has to have that mosquito vector in order to spread. So even if someone does get yellow fever, they can't spread it to another person without the mosquito to carry it. But for yellow fever, that's a tough one. There's really not an effective treatment for that. If you get yellow fever, you pretty much either make it or you don't. There's no real, yellow fever is a virus. So there's no really effective antiviral treatment for that one. But as I mentioned, when people got it in the past, yes, there was a high chance that you would not make it, but if you did, you got lifelong immunity. So that really helped out people who lived in areas where it was endemic. If they got it as a childhood illness, then they never had to worry about it again. Malaria, there are anti-malarial drugs. Some of those have been in the news lately with COVID-19 because there's some debate as to whether or not they can be effective. I am not going to venture an opinion on that one way or the other because I'm not a doctor or an epidemiologist. But suffice it to say that malaria is still with us and is likely to still be with us for quite some time. But yellow fever and plague, for the most part, we got those. Yes, next.
We just have a few more minutes left. Well, you did have a request to put your references back up on the screen so folks can see it in the few minutes we have left. We had another really quick question. Did the rats die at the end, at the same level that humans did of the plague? And somebody else also asked, have there been pandemics that were treated successfully? So rats, what was their death rate during the massive time of the plague?
I don't know what rate it would kill the rats, but it definitely did also kill the rats. I don't know if it's as virulent among rats as it is amongst people. That'd be an interesting question. I have to research that one. I just don't know the answer to that one off the top of my head. Have there been pandemics that were successfully treated? Well, I mean, the one that comes to mind is the 1918 flu. I wouldn't say it was successfully treated, but by people doing things like social distancing and wearing masks during the 1918 flu, some areas did actually implement those things. It did drastically reduce the number of people who became infected. And then there were other areas where they did not do that and did not stop people from gathering in large groups. And those areas did see very serious death rates from 1918 flu. Another one that comes to mind is smallpox. When the British invaded, when the British would send troops over from Europe, American soldiers would catch smallpox from the Europeans who had immunity to it, but the Americans did not. So there actually was an inoculation for it, and George Washington actually made that inoculation compulsory for the soldiers in his army, and as a result, even though it was really primitive and some of his soldiers did develop smallpox and die from it, it actually did protect the rest of his soldiers from getting smallpox, which is a very, very deadly disease. Smallpox has a very high mortality rate. It is very contagious. So that would be one where I say we managed to stop an epidemic disease.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you
Absolutely.
everybody for joining us. It's just about 1 o'clock, so we're going to wrap up our inaugural digital lunch break science. Thank you guys for helping us do our very first one, and we look forward to some of you guys joining us next week. We're hoping to keep doing these as a whole series. And I wanted to also give a big shout out to our sponsor, Bon Secours, who helped make our lunch break science possible. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everyone, and please stay safe and healthy.
Thanks, everyone.